Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand human decision making. It's also a welcome back to my two guests, Rory Sutherland and Gerald Ashley. Both Rory and Gerald have been on the show before, so they quite literally need no introduction. Though if you do need one, you'll find it in the previous episode. Links to those are in the show notes. As a quick one-liner, let me tell those of you that haven't come across them that I'm bringing a marketing man who thinks innovatively, together with a finance man who also thinks innovatively. What they have in common is an ability and willingness to explore the world as it really is, rather than the way we'd like it to be. Which, of course, is what we need to do if we want to understand and mitigate human risk. Rory and Gerald's individual appearances have been two of the most downloaded episodes of the Human Risk podcast. As you'll hear, they know each other really well and, like talented musicians, riff off each other nicely. Having had the pleasure of seeing both of them together on a panel earlier this year, I thought I'd bring the band back together. Now, usually big stars do duets to mark big occasions, and the big occasion here is the 100th episode of the Human Risk podcast. Yes, I can't quite believe it myself, but this little show is about to go into three figures. So I wanted something a little special to mark that occasion. Unsurprisingly, Rory and Gerald delivered precisely that. In fact, they delivered so much of an episode that I've had to split it into two parts. The first, the 99th episode of the Human Risk podcast, explores the subject of networks. The second, the 100th, looks at prosilience. No, I hadn't heard of it either, but it's a fascinating idea. Listeners who've heard both of them will know that neither Gerald nor Rory need much encouragement to talk. So stand by for lots of Rory, lots of Gerald, and just a tiny bit of me. Because both of them are great storytellers, they illustrate their points with lots of real-life examples. Listeners who haven't lived in the UK might not immediately recognise some of the news stories or be familiar with the items they refer to. You'll definitely understand the points they're making. So if you've never heard of Marmite, the rabbit phone, or what Londoners call the tube map, that's the map of the underground transit system, you'll find links to help you learn more about all of them in the show notes. I'm releasing these two episodes between Christmas and New Year of 2020. So as a year that hasn't exactly been easy comes to an end, I want to take this opportunity to wish all my listeners a very happy holiday season and to wish you all the best for 2021. Stay safe, and please enjoy the 99th episode of the Human Risk podcast with Rory Sutherland and Gerald Ashley. Gerald and Rory, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you very much, Christian. Yes.
I think what you both have in common is that you see the world the way it is rather than often the way that we'd like to see it. And so what I wanted to do was to kick off and let the conversation go wherever it goes, but start looking at the subject of networks, which I know is something that you've both explored in various different ways. So perhaps, Gerald, if you can just kick us off with some thoughts on networks, and then Rory, jump in as and when.
Okay, let's start by the sort of obvious thought that we're aware of lots of the networks we're in, whether they're social, commercial, or financial. But I think the way we look at a lot of the networks that we're involved in is far too simplistic. We have a tendency to see things in a linear fashion and to believe that life is a series of linear decisions, one after the other. And I think this is where we get caught out when what we think of as a surprise or a disruption suddenly comes into view. We're not really geared up for surprises and disruptions. Here we go straight away. We like certainty. We want, a certain amount of grid, if you like, around the world in which we occupy. And I don't know what Rory's view is, but the more I look at it, the more I realise how very fluid everything is.
Yeah, I think the need to explain the world makes us worse at understanding it. And I think what we've done is we've bred and selected for and promoted a class of kind of technocratic people. I'm going to start using mad alt-right language in a second, like talking about the technocratic elite, and the mainstream media. But bear with me for a second, okay? We've bred a class of people who are basically bright enough to use Newtonian physics, but they're not bright enough to understand anything more complicated than that. So ordinary people, by and large, I think, make instinctive decisions with quite a good evolved understanding of network dynamics, oddly. I think if you leave things to instinct, I think we understand the world quite well instinctively because we've evolved to understand a networked world. And we understand that things like reputation are not linear. You know, you don't gain a bit, lose a bit. It's not an additive function, right?
Yeah.
As in the joke that ends, you shag one sheep, right? Nobody ever says, say what you like about Jimmy Saville. He did a lot of good work for charity. You know, we understand that things like reputation are highly non-linear and that once it's gone, it's gone, right? So I think we instinctively understand that the world is networked, but once it comes to displaying expertise and confidence in our ability to argue for our decision, we fall back on this Newtonian physics model and we start to view it as a representation of reality in the same way that, and by the way, I think it starts off helpful and then with overuse and more widespread use becomes problematic. So it's like the tube map, okay? It's kind of helpful to have a graphic representation of how tube stations interrelate on the network, okay? But then two things happen. Over time, we start to think that the tube map represents London, and we start to think of the tube map as a map of London, when, of course, for example, it woefully underrepresents South London, because South London runs on a rail network, not a tube network, primarily. Anybody looking to, make a good gain, buy property in South London next to a railway station, it's undervalued for that reason. North Londoners think that Fulham is central because it's on the tube network and it's on the tube map, whereas in reality it's so far west it should have its own time zone, okay? And so that's one problem, which is over time we start to think of the tube map as if it were London, when it isn't. It's a grotesque distortion of reality. The second thing is, as everybody uses the same tube map, you start getting systemic problems because the central line is overused by everybody because it's in a straight line that runs from left to right. So it looks fast. The Victoria line, which is actually the best line on the network, because it was added last to the map, it goes in a massive wiggle on the map. It doesn't go in a wiggle in reality, but it's a massively wiggly line on the map, and the Victoria line is collectively underused. What
I would say there, Rory, is there's a tension here, if you like, between networks and frameworks. I think the human desire to frame everything, to put it on a grid, to reduce it to some simplified form, is part of the problem. And the other half of the problem is, and I think it's very true at the moment, we're starting to live in an overly connected world. So the tube map, if you like, because we both love the tube map, so we shall talk a lot about that, I'm sure. But the tube map actually is bad in another way, that it gives this framework to the idea of reality, whereas many things in life are just not in that nice linear 2D map. We love frameworks, but frameworks, as you just said, they work up to a point, and then they degrade, I think, after a certain level.
Yes, maybe there should be a sort of statute of limitations on the use of models.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, also, I think we're seeing it at the moment with this whole business about the virus. It's absolutely not properly appreciated or not properly thought through what models do. They don't predict anything, or they shouldn't be sold as predicting things. They are merely offering us a set of scenario of ranges of possibilities. But I'm afraid people look at a model and they treat it as if it must be brilliant because some guy who's got a PhD in curly brackets has produced the answer and the solution. And yes, I'm not saying, yeah.
And then the framework generates a level of confidence which simply isn't warranted. And so, a wonderful example of that, there are many, many examples of highly intelligent and educated people. This is why it's a problem, okay? Basically, we generate far more data and statistics, and we've suddenly generated exponentially more data and statistics in the last 20 years without a corresponding exponential increase in the number of competent statisticians to interpret So a classic example is what became known for some reason as the Danish Mask Study, which showed that masks don't work, okay? And very interestingly, Nassim Taleb has just pulled this to pieces and said that once you account for false positives in the test, the evidence, the very same evidence, once you assume false positives, actually assumes a very strong level of efficacy in masks, which is somewhere between like 25 and 100%. Okay.
Yeah.
And so exactly that same data, if slightly misinterpreted, the classic case, which I'll ask you to Google afterwards, is the solicitor Sally Clark, who had suffered 2 infant deaths, SID, sudden infant death syndrome, effectively of 2 male children, one after the other. And a highly intelligent man, I won't name him, but he was a revered medical man, effectively multiplied the odds together to give the chance that this was coincidence.
Yeah, no, that was an horrific example. The other thing, and I think a lot can be learnt in life from reading Daily Mail articles on what you should and shouldn't be eating. We're doing this as a sound recording rather than a visual one, but I've got a graph somewhere in a drawer that shows that from various articles in the Daily Mail that tomatoes are very good for you, that they will definitely kill you. Eat an egg and you risk your life. You must eat 3 eggs a day. And so people cherry pick data. We all do it all the time, and I think that's a huge problem, actually.
I'm generally pro-egg on the simple evolutionary basis that we're a kind of tree-climbing monkey with prehensile thumbs. Okay, so it's highly unlikely we haven't been stealing and eating eggs for rather a long time. And so we're probably kind of used to them by now.
You're in the Maurice Saatchi camp, I think, because didn't he go on some stupendous diet that's just involved eating 6 eggs every day for 3 months or something quite ridiculous?
More or less nothing else. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think we should have a health warning on this podcast that do not do this at home or something like that.
Other diets are available.
Exactly. Another point about networks, which I think is important, and I know both of us have written on this actually, and Rory in particular, is the fact how they can cause a sort of embedded inefficiency in that once you get a legacy network of whatever type it may be, it can be very difficult to shift it. So you get monopoly situations in networks, which are not always the best way forward and can be incredibly difficult to shift. They get shifted eventually, but you often need a lot of time and money to make that happen.
Well,
I think
two examples I've given, which are very simple. And I think my value as an advertising person in this debate is patently does not lie in understanding the mathematics, okay? But where it sometimes lies is in understanding the trivial everyday examples where such complex effects manifest themselves, okay? And so the stemmed wine glass and the low adoption of video conferencing are both cases where there's a network effect in that every restaurant owns 200 stemmed wine glasses, okay? Every household owns 8 of them. We should have got rid of them years ago, okay? They don't fit in the dishwasher. They've got a ridiculously high center of gravity. If anybody joggles against one, it catapults the contents of your wine glass across the room rather than keeping it in a confined space. The whole thing is a totally misconceived notion. But the fact is that you don't break all your wine glasses at once. So when you break one stemmed wine glass, you replace it with another one to replace the set, okay? And in the same way with video conferencing, it was a coordination problem. Now, the fax machine had its adoption massively accelerated in the 1980s by a postal strike. We forget this, but it was the equivalent of COVID for the use of Zoom. Because it's a simultaneous change, which therefore enables you to reach a new equilibrium. And you can't often reach a new equilibrium one person at a time. So the standard, and this is very important for marketing because a large part of the adoption of new behaviors and new ideas does not happen linearly. It's on a sigmoid curve where there are early adopters to begin with who are basically wankers like me who spend about 20% of my disposable income on largely pointless electronic gadgets on the off chance that 10% of them might be useful. Okay. And then eventually that migrates to a wider group of people, and then the thing becomes normalized. If you look at the microwave oven, if you look at the fax machine. Now, what's interesting about that is we tend to look at the efficacy of our advertising as though the effect on behavior were linear. And so we'll tend to look at advertising in the early stages of a product and go, there isn't enough advertising for electric cars, right? Because they don't sell very much. Okay, so you can't make the business case for advertising them, but arguably it's advertising at this stage of adoption which will actually pay the most in the long term. Later on, we'll go, God, isn't our electric car advertising effective? When what's actually happening is that there's a contagion effect, and suddenly they've been normalised.
I think what's interesting here, Rory, we're at the both ends of the curve, because I'm a late adopter. In fact, some technologies I've completely missed. The MiniDisc, whatever that was, I never had a MiniDisc player.
Nor me. No.
Blu-ray is a foreign country to me. I have no idea what people are talking about. And what I like about my position on the curve is that you're funding me, because I like the idea of people going out buying loads of products and kicking it around, and then we get a critical mass. And then if I can even be bothered, I shall get round to buying it. The risk in my position is I'm so late that everybody has moved on to the next S-curve.
I'm the Darwinian mutation, effectively, in the technological ecosystem. Yeah,
that's a very dangerous thing to be, of course.
It is.
A fancy way of saying you're a mistake.
Yes,
you're a copying error.
On the other hand, you see, this is the belief, certainly from Geoffrey Miller, that wings evolved as ornamentation before they became useful for mobility. So that sometimes what you might call sexual selection or showing off in the tech world, okay, actually provides the early stage funding for inventions and paths of development before they become widely useful. So the early days of the automobile, probably there was a period of 10 or 15 years where it made more sense to have a horse than it did to have a car.
Yeah.
And it was the human urge to show off their new car. Neophilia combined with, to be honest, simple vanity actually drove the development to a stage where the car could then become more useful than a horse for its utility rather than its signalling value.
I mean, it's one of the great mysteries in life as to why some things take off and other things don't. I think the last time I spoke with Christian, we talked about why is it that certain ideas or memes go viral. And I said, well, you need to talk to Rory about this because he's in the business of trying to make things go viral. But I think it's true to say, isn't it? It is still, a large mystery as to why things suddenly get adopted and take off. I guess you would say in the advertising industry that you're trying to apply booster rockets at just the right point in the curve to make it happen.
Yeah, it undoubtedly can accelerate the curve. I mean, I think that the adoption of solar panels is now predominantly a marketing problem, not a technological one. Now, that isn't to dismiss the very valuable work done by people in making them both cheaper and more efficient. But the real problem now is how do you get someone to put them on the goddamn roof? It isn't, do we make them 3% more efficient and 10% cheaper? Because that isn't the decisive factor.
I'm just going to say, Roy, I've just thought of another thing where if we look at it from the other point of view, why do certain things not work and never take off? I always think of the kitchen stool. Now, the kitchen stool is the one that's got the built-in ladder. And it makes a really crap stool because the ladder doesn't fit probably inside it, that sort of thing you pull out from the side. And if you want to use it as any form of ladder, well, it gets you 2 feet in the air. So it manages to be a product that combines the worst of being the stool and the worst of being a ladder. And I think we see a lot of that in technologies that don't quite happen.
Well, what I want to do is actually form a kind of technological cold case squad. You know all those detective stories, it's always a bit more exciting when an episode of Waking the Dead or Inspector Morse tries to solve a problem, a murder that happened in 1930 rather than one that happened last week. Okay. Somehow. Now, I think we could go back on old technologies and say, let's look for old technologies that should have worked but didn't. But let's also look at technologies that did take off but shouldn't.
Yeah.
And one of them will be email, because I think it's a classic example of a network problem. Now, everybody thought individually that email was brilliant because I could send a memo without needing a PA or a typist or a typing pool. Okay, I could send a memo instantaneously to anybody in the world I wanted to, and that made me feel great. If you look at the ratio now of the number of emails in a day you receive compared to the number you instigate, by which I mean how rarely you press that new email button compared to how often you press reply or forward or reply to all, okay, the ratio is something like 120 emails received to about 3 to 6 generated.
That doesn't surprise me, actually.
And actually, it's appalling because it's turning you into a bureaucratic administrator, not a manager, essentially. And the very fact that email is asynchronous creates a kind of bureaucracy in decision-making where it's very, very easy to pass the problem on to somebody else and wait 3 days for a reply. Now, video conferencing.
Yeah, I once worked in an office where a guy the other side of a wall would send me an email rather than poke his head round a corner and talk.
Yeah.
And I think this is why texting took off in Japan. You know, the Japanese are legendary in social shyness and being a little bit withdrawn with strangers or people they perceive to be more senior. And texting did nothing until it went to Japan, and it was an instant hit because you could sort of hide behind the text a little.
And I suppose actually the cost of high levels of politeness in Japanese society means that any face-to-face encounter has to be imbued with quite a lot of symbolic acts.
Yeah, it's very asymmetric, isn't it? I mean, if you're to either side, you know, there's such a differentiation between the buyer and receiver of status. I think that's the case. You've just prompted the thought of, from a past product, which I'm sure you'll remember, Rory. Early mobile phones, the rabbit phone. Do you remember the rabbit phone?
I can go one better, and it proves my point.
Well, no, I've got a point about it.
I actually had one.
Oh, well, brilliant. Well, you will recall the slightly insane business that you had to be close to a base station before you could make a telephone call.
It was essentially a phone box where you carried the phone around yourself. It didn't receive incoming calls, and you could simply stand in the street and make mobile calls wherever there was a rabbit sign, including, I distinctly remember, the Happy Eater at Burford on the A40, because I can actually remember climbing out of my car and walking towards the building to phone my parents to tell them I was on the way. So I can remember using a rabbit phone because, like an idiot, of course, I had to buy every new technology that had appeared. And, it was completely asymmetrical. Absolutely.
The thought I had was that there are a lot of stepping stones before we get to something that's going to be widely adopted. I mean, I didn't see the point of a rabbit phone, really, unless I happened to be standing in Waterloo Station or something where there was a base station. So sometimes the intermediate steps require sort of gadget freaks to buy them to help fund to where we need to get to.
Yes, I think that's true. And I also think, by the way, there are technologies that fascinate me from my cold case squad, which is I'm absolutely convinced that if Harris Tweed had been invented last year by a team in Silicon Valley, we'd consider it a miracle fabric. I don't know, if you've got any Harris Tweed clothing, you can effectively put it on the floor, stamp on it, get your dog to urinate on it, pack it in a suitcase, okay? Leave it in the suitcase for 2 weeks, arrive somewhere else, take it out of the suitcase, shake it twice, and it looks immaculate, okay? And yet, had it been invented by Silicon Valley, we'd be going around going, isn't this just incredible? But because it's already existed as the product of long evolution, we discount it. So I think the cold case squad needs to be looking at email from a point of view of things that were adopted that shouldn't have been. But we also need to look at Harris Tweed from the point of view of things that made obvious sense that never went as big as they deserved.
This has got other implications, hasn't it? I can't remember the exact anniversary, but it's relatively recently that the BBC did an anniversary programme about when the BBC, was it called Acorn Computer, first came out. And one of the early ideas they had was every kid, or I think it was every school actually, was going to have an Acorn computer. And one of the early projects that was taken up by the British Library, I believe, was to put the Domesday book onto some sort of computer files. Well, they put them on Acorn computer files, and of course, try and find a machine that can read the damn stuff. And either of you might know, but there is a guy somewhere who keeps a hardware museum. He keeps it so it's a record of all the sort of plastic junk we have been using since the late 1960s. But now and again, people turn up and say, I can't find anything that will read this disc or this tape. Can you try and sort it out for me? So whilst we think everything's permanent and digital and embedded, in some ways things might be a little bit ephemeral because of the hardware.
Yeah, I should defend myself, I suppose, in that I was an early adopter of the rabbit phone, but I was also an early user of the internet. So I first used it in 1987, before there was a web. And that was because my brother was an academic at the same university as me. So he was an astrophysicist, I was a classicist, but it meant I could blag time on the university computer. And I started using Usenet. And my first experience was finding a guy in Connecticut who owned a 1950s London taxi where he could order a new fuel pump from. And even back then, in my defense, I thought this is actually going to be really important. If you have a global mode of communication which is effectively free. In the case of video conferencing, I was also an early evangelist for that. And I couldn't understand the low level of adoption, really, until I realized that actually this is Nassim Taleb's minority rule point, which is in any meeting of people, it only requires 2 Luddites for 6 people who want to work remotely and 2 people to work in the office to set the norm as office work and face-to-face meeting. And so the hybrid meeting always becomes a physical meeting by default. And it took a pandemic to actually change that. Now, interestingly, 2 things. I suggested to Zoom in June last year that the thing they should do to try and promote video conferencing was to create the idea of Zoom Fridays, so that you created a social norm where people would, just as you had dress down Fridays, you created a social norm which was already in operation, albeit unofficially. It was don't ask, don't tell, where people worked from home on a Friday. And then the idea was you make a norm around remote meeting on Fridays, and then it'll spread to Monday and then Thursday. Because I thought there was a synchronicity coordination problem in the network adoption of Zoom, which required a certain period of time to be everybody online before you could get it to take off. Now, interestingly, Nassim Taleb's minority rule, I thought he might be slightly upset by this, but the minority rule point is that if you have a mixed gender party, you'll always end up drinking wine, because basically men will drink whatever they can get their hands on, whereas 35% of women don't drink beer. So you can't have beer in a mixed gender party. And so if you want to...
It's the lowest denominator, effectively, isn't it?
So the lowest common denominator is effectively red and white wine, because everybody can drink it.
It'll be sweet white, won't it, when you come down to the push?
Yeah.
To be honest.
That's probably right. Yeah, white wine becomes there are a few occasions, a summer garden party, Pimm's has a certain network of power, in certain contexts. And my idea, I suppose, was to create the Pimm's garden party for Zoom. But the interesting thing is, I can say, and Nassim retweeted it, so he obviously isn't that angry about it, is that indirectly from Nassim, actually it's from a French complexity physicist to Nassim. So it's a French complexity physicist who had the idea of minority rule, which is a small intransigent minority can prevent the majority from adopting a mildly preferred solution. Okay, so this is why pizza is very popular. It's because nobody hates it. Okay, so it's the kind of default food for a party, because you can serve pizza, and with the exception of my dad, no one refuses to eat it. Whereas you couldn't have chicken fowl at a party, even if 95% of the people there sensibly enjoyed chicken fowl, because there'd be 2 people, my wife included, who go, it's too spicy. I point out that, anyway. But the interesting thing is, via me, so the French complexity physicist to Nassim, to me, to Dane Smith at Ogilvy, Australia, to KFC Australia, has inspired in Australia the build your own bucket for KFC. because they realized that the problem with those mass buckets is you always had a certain number of people who hated certain foodstuffs within the bucket.
I have to say, this is a dystopian idea.
No!
I can't think of anything less I want to be doing than building my own bucket.
But you can go boneless, you can go heavy on the kind of, the hull or the breast or the wing. Okay. So the minority problem, and KFC is Lindy, by the way, I think. So I think Nassim should be perfectly happy with it. I think it's food. I think it's, there will always be KFC. But actually, it's very interesting because it's the insight that actually marketing mostly focuses on making people like things more, because then the aggregate effect will be overall Brownian conversion, okay, as though things permeated linearly through a population. Whereas the marketing insight also needs to be around what's stopping this. Is there a small group of people who are effectively stopping this network product from taking off? Okay? So by the way, if you deal with the NHS, you probably need to own a fax machine still.
Well, this brings us to what must be one of the most critical questions in the world. Why is there, and this will really only appeal maybe to UK listeners, why is there this absolutely religious split between those who like and dislike Marmite? I would say I'm a Marmite agnostic, which is really very rare. But most people can identify more strongly with it being plus or minus the pro or anti-Marmite than their football team, political views or anything else. It's interesting from a marketing point of view. You get a product that seems to generate such strong feelings.
No, that's interesting. There is a theory which also explains why foreigners mostly find it disgusting, which is unless you're given it before a certain age, you will never like it.
That may be true. I mean,
you must have been given it just on the cusp, you see, Gerald.
Yeah. I tell you what. I mean, I've never met any converts either. I've never met people who stop me in the street and say, I used to hate Marmite, but now I love it.
Well, I think it might be adaptive preference formation, which is we just decide, okay, we're either, rather as cat-dog. People tend to be cat people and dog people when actually the similarities are far greater than the differences, I suppose, in aggregate.
It's worked well in this sort of tongue-in-cheek marketing of Marmite make a big thing of the fact that a lot of people hate it. A little bit. Avis made a big thing of talking about, well, Hertz is always going to be number one, but hey-ho, we're quite happy being number two because we're very self-confident in our position. So I suppose you can work around these preferences.
And I suppose the other thing is, if you're the lone person in the household who likes Marmite, the strategy gives you validation, doesn't it? It encourages you to be part of the awkward squad, and you can get your mum to buy Marmite, even if you're the only person who eats it.
Yeah, there may be a social cost there that you give up the alpha points, for what is the better phrase.
I genuinely think that what we're doing here, which is the translation of network theory into marketing, is genuinely valuable. In the same way, there's a very famous experiment in evolutionary psychology, which is if you ask people to say, if there is a vowel on the front of these cards, there must be an odd number on the back. Which cards do you need? Which of these four cards do you need to turn over to?
This is the Wason test, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got it exactly. And Cosmides and Tooby replaced it with a different test, which is you're not allowed to drink under the age of 18. And two of the cards, one of them had a Coke, one of them had a lager, one of them had an old person, one of them had a child. And it said, which ones do you need to turn over? Now, in the first case of the Wason cards, even something like 60% of people at Princeton got it wrong. Okay. Now, just to get this right, you have to turn over. I won't give it away because people can go and Google it and do it for themselves. But when they changed the question to, you have to be over 18 to drink, basically everybody got it right because they checked the child wasn't drinking an alcoholic drink and they checked the alcoholic drink wasn't in the hands of a child, and then they'd stop. Okay?
Now, that's really important because what you're saying there is that context is a huge part of understanding what's going on.
Now, as evolutionary psychologists, they extrapolated that to mean that we have an instinctive understanding of social rules, whereas we don't have an instinctive understanding of mathematical logic. And I suppose you've got to turn over what did I say? If there is a vowel, there has to be an odd number. Well, you obviously have to turn over a vowel, and most people get. But it doesn't say there has to be an even number on the other side of a consonant. Okay. And a lot of people, I think, turn over the consonant, they turn over the number. Equally, the number 5 is meaningless. The only thing you have to turn over is actually the number 6. Okay. Because if there were a vowel on the other side of the number 6, then the rule is invalidated. But our instinctive understanding of the social rule. Now, we have an instinctive understanding of marketing in a way that we don't have an instinctive understanding of mathematical logic. So I think the Galapagos Islands of marketing is a useful place, just as actually most network theory people are really interested in trains, because it's essentially a complex problem, and why we're interested in maps, because it's a complex problem using kind of terminology and representations we can all understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's the old phrase that you lose half of readership of your book every time you print an equation. And I think that's very true. I mean, if you were mad enough to have a fairly small readership and have half a dozen equations, you probably only got about 1 or 2 people left at the end. We don't think in that sort of mathematical shorthand. I would agree with that completely. One other thought a wider thought on networks has occurred to me is, who owns the network? You know, we're what are we on here? Squadcast or something. I don't know who promotes that one, but Christian can tell us, no doubt. But we're reliant on, obviously, the internet. We're reliant on the software. We're reliant on electricity coming out and down a wire. And at one level, all of this appears to be free. But, of course, it isn't. But the economics of networks, I think, are very interesting. And what isn't talked enough about is the control factor. If for some reason the electricity goes, or I get banned from the internet, who knows? Hasn't happened to me yet. But are we going to get to a stage where people will be excluded from networks for, maybe good reasons or bad reasons? I think that's a very big issue as well.
That points to the whole thing in China, right, where digital payments and ability to travel and all those things are driven by access, in effect, barring you from accessing the network.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that you have social points, that if you misbehave, they take some of their benefits away and all the rest of it. And effortlessly steering the conversation away from rabbit phones and Marmite. I think why don't we talk about why your phone talks to your fridge? And this is this rather bizarre idea of, or I find it bizarre, that we all should be on the Internet of Things all the time, and that everything needs to be really joined up and connected. I find that slightly dystopian. I don't want my fridge telling Waitrose that I need another 2 pints of milk, and will they add it to my next grocery order? But the way of some networks is going, we're being driven in that direction.
Well, also, if you think about it, I always recommend people, if you're thinking of commuting, moving out of London and commuting, I always recommend Kent, because for historical reasons, and slightly obscure historical reasons, it's effectively got 4 complementary rail networks, okay? And the reason for this is you had 4 railway companies competing to get the valuable traffic from Dover and Folkestone, the Channel traffic. And so we have a high level of redundancy in our rail network. We also have 2 more or less parallel motorways, by the way. Now, having the M2 and the M20 more or less parallel is a seeming inefficiency, okay? But it's actually valuable because it gives you redundancy. And it's doubly valuable ever since the sat-nav was invented, because occasionally your sat-nav will tell you to start your journey on the M2 and then flip onto the M20 to avoid some weird, tailback around Maidstone, okay? Now, interestingly, most business decision makers, now if you think about it, the people who developed online grocery delivery never used resilience once. They were doing it because they were terrified of losing customers, okay?
Yeah.
And yet, come COVID, the extra resilience in food distribution, particularly to the elderly, that was made possible through the existence of online grocery delivery was significant, I think, in the UK. I think it was valuable, okay? But now, interestingly, it occurs to me that left to their own devices, businesses love a kind of monopolistic and low redundancy, highly efficient, but highly fragile solution to a problem. Consumers, entirely unintentionally, okay, create resilience through their own perversity of behavior by demanding lots of different things. And so one of the interesting things is unintentional resilience really interests me. The extent to which actually free market capitalism is more resilient than the control economy kind, precisely because it has to cater for a greater range of tastes.
Yeah, the other thing is, of course, you're alighting on our joint enemy of efficiency. If you have an overly efficient system, it actually starts to degrade. You actually have to have some looseness in a system. And I think this is a problem of trying to run one's life by spreadsheet, if you like. And resilience, of course, costs money. And
or does it? Now, I'm going to ask you, I've always assumed that resilience costs money. And then I've realized there's a way of reframing it as prosilience, which is that the rewards from resilience are twofold. One, you don't die in the event of some particular collapse in your optimized supply chain. Two, it gives you more chances of getting lucky.
Well, I guess it comes down to who's paying for it.
Yeah.
But if you're
a finance guy looking at short-term finances would see resilience as a cost. I think a probabilistic thinker would go, so it's my argument with nuclear power stations, okay? There's this big debate, you know this, Gerald, between do you have these monster nuclear power stations that produce so many gigawatts, or do you have many smaller Rolls-Royce power stations, or there's even a Silicon Valley company which has an Aurora power station, which is like the size of a house. Do you have many more small power stations? And my argument is, given the timescales involved, you have to bet on both, because huge opportunities will present themselves which deliver benefits to one or the other, which you can never predict adequately in advance. In the same way that Microsoft was working on 3 operating systems, Microsoft nearly killed Windows, okay? It was working on OS for IBM. It was working on DOS. It was working on some other project. They nearly killed the Windows project because they thought it wasn't necessary. They thought it was redundant. OS2, yeah. And Microsoft, suddenly Windows 3.0 became an absolute killer. They never predicted it. It just happened, okay? So I would argue that the belief that resilience is necessarily a cost applies only to a deterministic universe and not to a probabilistic one.
Well, yeah, fair enough. But I would counter slightly that who wants to be a shareholder owning Betamax? You know, the shareholders are not happy and the bean counters are not happy. But if you have it's a paradox of where you want to have a market that sort of everybody has a go at developing a product, and then it is more efficient and beneficial to the overall universe of people if there is one particular winner.
Yeah.
So Betamax didn't happen. Philips 2000, I believe, was thought to be a very superior system at one.
Yeah.
But of course, it was VHS to one. I think
there was a small reason on that with Video 2000, which is porn was probably more important than anybody admitted in the VHS and beta wars.
I'm pleased that you raised that as being the expert voice on this, Rory. But I was about to say I have heard it said that porn was a driver. In fact, that particular industry, so I am said, is a great driver in lots of areas of e-commerce and all the rest of it. And it's quite extraordinary, really. So it's follow the money, isn't it? Not what people say, but what people do.
It's revealed preference, not stated preference, undoubtedly there.
And we're going to leave it there for the 99th episode of the Human Risk podcast. And as you know from my introduction, this conversation will continue into the 100th episode. That will be out fairly shortly after this one. So you can find that wherever you got hold of this. It'll be on all of the major podcasting platforms. My interim thanks to Rory and Gerald for their fascinating conversation. Lots more to look forward to in the 100th episode. In the meantime, if you enjoy the show and had a chance to leave a review for it, that is hugely appreciated. It really, really helps. Look out for the 100th episode coming very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.